My three key words in the title are prospect, power and paradigm. So prospect is landscape, power is public versus market, national versus local, and the complexities of their interface. And paradigm picks up the changing planning, architectural and landscape fashions. The major theme tying the bits of this together is the changing status of Canberra as a national capital. Over time, its historic rationale and qualities have interacted with many changing circumstances: economic, political, demographic, environmental, and at different scales from the local to the global. The symbolic status, governance, economy and culture of the city over this time, over more than a century, have been massively rescripted. Along the way, the exceptionalism which marked its first half century has been steadily eroded, though not terminally, as it negotiates a very different and more fractious world in the 21st century. So the extent to which this story is unique or not may well be considered in your broader deliberations in this conference. So what I'm going to try and pack into 20 odd minutes is a rapid evolutionary narrative from early thinking about what a national capital might be to the contemporary neoliberal era with self-government and rising market power. In the process, I guess the theme is that the national capital status of Canberra shrinks. It normalises as a distinctive city, but one which embodies and reflects many of the same trends and tensions as in other big Australian cities. So the first phase of imagining a capital. The separate British colonies federated in 1901, and the question of the form and nature of a federal seat of government had wafted through debates in the 1890s, but a completely new greenfield city was what was decided upon. A rather utopian choice, but also one way of mediating the rivalry between the two biggest cities at that time and now, Sydney and Melbourne. That's where the star is, Canberra. But remember, much of the inland territory is desert, and so the location here is oriented to the main centre of population gravity. What might the capital look like? Well, there were many fanciful notions, like this one from 1899, which transposes the British Houses of Parliament to a rugged Australian setting. Here's another waterside capital from 1901. Some of you might have seen this image. While produced in a spirit of idealistic nationalism, it depicts a very un-Australian scene of largely classic-inspired buildings. In design terms, the radial city was frequently invoked, with the hub being the centre of political power. This is from Jean-Claudius Loudon's remarkably early 1822 version, where he actually refers to this as a possible scheme for the national capital of Australia. This citadel form, rotating around a federal parliamentary core, gains currency. Here we see it in a paper presented at the Royal Institute of British Architects Conference in 1910. Is one version of what that core might look like, produced while the judging for the Federal Capital Design Competition of 1912 was underway. So I'd move on to that second of my 5 phases. And by 1908, the site for the new capital had been selected, sheep country in southern New South Wales. The government set in train a process of buying up all the private property, assembling a public land bank to prevent speculation inspired by the ideas of Henry George. And this created the present-day Australian Capital Territory. The design competition attracted over 130 entries. It was controversial, like many aspects of Canberra's history. And the winning scheme by Walter Burley Griffin and his wife, Marion Marnie, although her crucial role was only much belatedly recognised, was a brilliant response to the landscape. The dominant building form here is the Ziggurat Tower, which, unlike much of the preceding thinking, was not a Houses of Parliament, but a building celebrating Australian democracy. This bastion was called the Capitol, doubled as the National Archives, and overlooked the Parliamentary building, which you might be able to see here. The power hub is the People's Capitol building. But many other design ideas of the time are represented here. Waterfront location, multiple centres, Beaux-Arts symmetry, garden suburbs, extensive open space system, reflecting a wide number of influences from Pierre L'Enfant's plan for Washington, DC to Burnham's plan for Chicago. The larger conception outside the formal core for ceremony and assembly and bureaucracy was a polycentric suburban town. In time, however, as that town grew, its needs would overshadow to some extent those of the federal core. Let's move to the third of my 5 phases, which is the actual establishment of the capital, which was named Canberra in 1913. And construction commenced with a coal-fired power station and a railway connection to the nearest country town. When Europeans first arrived here, there were probably several hundred Aboriginal people who lived on the limestone plains. They created a civilization which used fire as a tool to refresh food sources, but colonial sheep stations moved in and saw even greater land clearance. So that meant that forestry, gardens and landscape were an important priority of the government, given the clearance and deforestation that had taken place. And the first place they started was in the central parliamentary core. The idea here being to get Canberra up and running for the opening of the federal parliament in 1927. So when that actually did happen, Canberra was still a pretty sparse landscape. So this image shows a hotel for politicians, senior government officials and visitors in the foreground, Parliament House, the white building in the centre, at the right, 2 office blocks for civil servants, in the distance, garden suburbs, an industrial centre, and beyond that, camp for the construction workers. So looking at this, you can see how Canberra was branded the bush capital. Until the 1960s, few Australians would have visited. It was isolated and without the national cultural institutions like galleries and libraries and art museums, which are there today. It was clearly planned, but in an unconvincingly scattered way, and utterly unlike the more urbanised coastal capitals that Australians were used to. So into the 1940s, Canberra really only grew very slowly. On the ground, the urban form was diffuse and half-hearted, as we see in this comparison between what was planned above and what had eventuated by the early 1950s. So by that time, perhaps 40 years on, no lake, incomplete boulevards, nothing on Capitol Hill, where Griffin wanted to put his People's Building. The core centres were indistinct. It wasn't much to write home about. So this was not really a statement of power, and something had to change because Canberra was attracting a planning critique. Just a pleasant garden town at best. A garden without a city was one of the bars. But to take the city to the next level required much more investment. The fourth and second last of my themes takes us from the 1950s to the 1980s. And following a government inquiry in 1957, the National Capital Development Commission, I'll call it the NCDC for its initials, was formed as an all-powerful body to design and construct the city. It was a new town corporation on the British model. Through the 1960s, the NCDC transformed what some had called a good sheep station spoilt into what many observers regarded as the model planned metropolis of the late 20th century. And this ushered in a period of high modernism, hierarchical street systems and centres, freeway networks, open space corridors, new offices, apartment blocks, neighbourhood planning, Radburn layouts. And these images from the 1970s of Canberra come from the slide collection of the American planning historian John Reps. So clockwise from bottom left, we've got traditional low-density housing, upper left, new town houses beginning to increase density, the concrete CBD area, and a pedestrianised suburban town centre largely unchanged today. In the outer city, the planning paradigm was ordered low-density development, not sprawl, because it was all micro-planned, but not yet as smart as it could be. The NCDC tackled long-term growth by decanting population into new residential districts. A distant inspiration was undoubtedly Ebenezer Howard, but these suburban new towns were more an American inspiration emerging from modelling by US transport engineers. There were landscape power plays happening within this bigger picture, most notably selection of a site for a permanent Parliament House. The 1966 proposal shown here puts that Houses of Parliament on the lakefront and used Oscar Niemeyer's buildings in Brasilia to convey what that might actually look like. William Holford, who had entered the Brasilia story a decade earlier, as many of you would know, favoured this location too. And on Capitol Hill, which had been the centrepiece of Griffin's scheme, he proposed, of all things, a royal pavilion, which would be home for the odd visit by the British monarch. In the end, after much debate, the parliamentarians selected the prominent Capitol Hill site for themselves. That was in 1974. The NCDC was an impressive city building organisation. Landscape was a primary technical function, probably a first for a city administration in Australia, but sitting alongside architecture, civic design and engineering. It seemed right for the times, aggressive development to address accelerating population growth. It was planning by professionals with limited public consultation. In the 1970s, when Australia began to contemplate a national growth centre scheme, Canberra, with its public-owned land bank and democratic efficiency, was sold as the way to go. We see that here in this paper, Canberra, an exemplar for many decentralised Australian cities. But there was pushback already happening. Most planners, or many planners, I should say, criticised Canberra as representing undemocratic and a monocultural form of suburbanism. Canberra residents themselves were feeling frozen out because there was very little local government. The greater Australian public probably didn't care very much at all. They just complained about the federal money that was going into the city. And the parliamentarians were also concerned about that too. As Canberra was maturing as a city, surely they asked it could look after itself, pay its own way, and introduce more private sector development. So that led in 1988 to the abolition of the NCDC and the instigation of self-government. And this legislative assembly building for the territory government would now arguably be more relevant to the everyday life of Canberrans and the National Parliament House. I come to rush through my final contemporary theme of the sustainable neoliberal city. The major changes in government in the late 1980s introduced a dual planning system. The National Capital Planning Authority, now the NCA, would oversee the urban parts of an open space system in orange at left, and in a more direct sense would control an even smaller territory of national land centred on the parliamentary area. And that's pretty much the division that we have through to the present day, with Canberra approaching a population of 400,000 people. The divided control, however, creates some skirmishes and tensions between the two levels of government, but that's the reality. Much has happened since the late 1980s, since self-government. Certainly, whole planning, development and environment management climate has changed as issues of sustainability, resilience, climate change, recognition of First Nations values have come to the fore. Traditional Canberra things like trees and open space have taken on far more importance beyond mere aesthetics. At the same time, there have been sharper challenges in balancing these environmental and cultural values against economic drivers of productivity, jobs and growth. And Canberra in that sense is no different from any other major Australian cities. Yet Canberra has the highest level of autodependency of any Australian city, largely thanks to the NCD motorway planning of the 1960s. And as a result, 80% of Canberrans drive their private cars to work. 85% of dwellings in Canberra are single-family detached. That low-density development continues, but often without the private space standards of the early garden suburbs. And between 2015 and 2020, the ACT government cleared over 6% of mature urban trees on the Canberra footprint. There has still been building on the fringe, therefore, although increasingly at higher densities. And that move towards compact cities is in line with a trend in all Australian cities as well. At the same time, we have seen higher levels of development, which have evolved from the new urbanism, 6-star green ratings, significant open space and conservation reservations, solar power, low carbon turn. But that sort of development comes at a price, and Canberra's housing market is now one of Australia's least affordable. And so we've got the vision of social inequality, with homelessness close to the national Australian average and spiking through COVID. In fact, there's now a Territory Minister for Homelessness and Housing Services. There is still acknowledgement of the Griffin heritage. This vision from the early 2000s did that with some credibility, although sometimes the new development is just new development that could be anywhere. But urban renewal has become an increasingly important driver. Canberra now, in fact, has a renewal agency. This would have been inconceivable in the NCD era, where the major mission was the rolling out of greenfield development. And indeed, it's a lot of that NCDC development that is the prime target for that renewal. National capitals change and evolve. So now we have private sector-led infield development happening all across the metropolitan area, here on lakeside land that was previously seen as sacrosanct. Canberra Airport sits on leased land from the federal government, which retains development approval, in a sense, a complicating third planning system alongside the existing two. It exemplifies the neoliberal term, with considerable office and retail development unrelated to airport operations and disrupting the ACT government plan for suburban town centres. So to conclude, let me return to the zone where Canberra's national capitalness, if I could use that word, is most evident, the central monumental core. This public realm has become increasingly contested, conceived as benign but ennobling structures and spaces of national unity. They are also places of dissent. The National War Memorial is undergoing a controversial upgrading involving demolition of an award-winning gallery and removal of a large number of mature native trees. The protest is both national and local, and scenes like this are not uncommon elsewhere in Canberra, which has the most educated community of any Australian city, with over half of the adults holding a bachelor's university degree. On the bigger stage, insurgency of a makeshift Aboriginal tent embassy to protest exclusion from land rights led the way 50 years ago. This remains in place interestingly with a national heritage listing, an unprettified informal insertion into the heart of the grand formality of Europeanised Canberra. While the early planners envisaged these empty open spaces as sites for national and community celebration, they have become reimagined as sites of political protest. This is a rally against mandatory COVID restrictions earlier this year. The Central Parliamentary area remains under the control of the National Capital Authority. The major new development coming here near the waterfront is an Indigenous centre for the nation, a long overdue development. Although I am emphasising a lot of things happening in Canberra that are reflections of what is happening elsewhere, this image also reveals its more unique qualities, most particularly the attention to landscape, with much of this, in fact, the treed landscape being planted in the last 100 years, and with the hills also kept clear of development. But we see here the essential DNA and geometry of a greenfield city genuflecting to the symmetry of 20th century planning. Yet strangely, neither the federal government or the territory government seems interested enough to recognise that national, let alone international, planning significance. One recent disappointment is the decision by the federal government not to include central Canberra on the government's list of national heritage sites. You won't have time to read this, but it's the rejection letter for a submission made a decade ago, and it notes that the ACT government made no submission on the issue at all. A clear sign, I think, of unease that more planning controls might stifle or complicate development, even in the heart of the national capital. So that's been a broad brush race across space and time. I'm sorry if I've done a little bit beyond my allocated 20 minutes, but I've tried to bring out this balancing act at the interface between Canberra as a national capital and Canberra as a metropolitan city. It's tried to capture this talk, the response of Canberra to new forces over time, both coming from within and coming from outside. And in the process, we see new chapters in its planning history being written. I'll end my presentation there. Thank you.